The courtroom was a symphony of murmurs and shuffled papers. Judge Henry Whitman, a seasoned magistrate with decades of experience, adjusted his glasses and scanned the docket. Known for his strict demeanor and no-nonsense approach to justice, he commanded the courtroom with an air of absolute authority. But today, he felt a strange tension, one that he couldn't quite place. "Next case," he announced, his voice booming across the courtroom. The bailiff called out, "Case 5729, State of Georgia versus Jacqueline Turner." From the back of the room, Jacqueline Turner rose and walked to the defendant's table. Heads turned, whispers amplified. She was striking, a tall woman with an undeniable aura of confidence. Yet there was something about her presence that seemed incongruous with her surroundings. She wore a plain gray suit, her hair tied back neatly. Despite the whispers and sidelong glances from the courtroom gallery, her expression remained calm, almost unbothered. Judge Whitman raised an eyebrow as he looked over her case file. Jacqueline Turner was being charged with contempt of court in a previous case, coupled with a hefty parking violation fine that had escalated due to unpaid tickets. He sighed. This wasn't the kind of high-profile case he preferred, but every detail had to be addressed with the same precision. "Ms. Turner," he began, his tone clipped. "You were being charged with failure to pay court-ordered fines and for contempt in a prior hearing. Do you have representation, or will you be representing yourself today?" "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor," Jacqueline replied, her voice steady. Judge Whitman's eyebrows shot up, though he quickly masked his surprise. Most people in her position fumbled nervously through hearings, but Jacqueline stood tall, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Very well," he said, nodding to the prosecutor. "Counsel, please proceed." The state's attorney, Mark Denning, was a confident, sharp-sighted man in his mid-30s. He wasted no time in painting a less than flattering picture of Jacqueline Turner. He listed her fines, emphasized the severity of her contempt charge, and made subtle insinuations about irresponsibility. Jacqueline listened without flinching, her gaze locked on Judge Whitman. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped forward with poise. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to retrieve documentation pertinent to my defense." Judge Whitman frowned. "Mr. Turner, you've had ample time to prepare. The court cannot—" "I assure you, Your Honor," she interrupted, her tone respectful but firm, "the documents I need will provide clarity and relevance to these charges. They are stored on my personal device, which I can access immediately." The room grew still. Rarely did defendants challenge Whitman, let alone with such conviction. After a moment of hesitation, he relented. "You have 10 minutes, Miss Turner." Jacqueline nodded, turned on her heel, and walked briskly out of the courtroom. 10 minutes turned into 15, then 20. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder as the time dragged on. Judge Whitman's patience wore thin. He tapped his gavel sharply. "Bailiff, go find the defendant. If she doesn't return within 5 minutes, this court will rule in absentia." The bailiff nodded and left the room. At exactly 25 minutes, Jacqueline returned, holding a leather-bound portfolio. She walked to her table with measured steps, her face unreadable. "My apologies for the delay, Your Honor," she said. "Apologies aren't sufficient," Whitman snapped. "You've wasted this court's time. I hope whatever you've retrieved is as relevant as you claim." "It is," she replied smoothly. "May I proceed?" He gestured for her to continue, leaning back in his chair with a skeptical expression. Jacqueline opened the portfolio and pulled out several documents. Your Honor, these are records of my compliance with prior court orders. Contrary to the state's claims, I have paid all fines associated with this case, and the alleged contempt charge stems from a clerical error during a previous hearing. She handed the papers to the bailiff, who passed them to Judge Whitman. He scanned them, his frown deepening. "Where did you acquire these?" he asked. "I maintain thorough records of all my legal proceedings," she replied. "As someone who frequently navigates the judicial system, I've learned the importance of keeping evidence readily available." The gallery buzzed with curiosity. Jacqueline's calm demeanor and precise arguments were unusual for someone accused of such charges. Judge Whitman glanced at the prosecutor, who looked equally bewildered. "Counsel, have you reviewed these documents?" Whitman asked. Denning stammered, "No, Your Honor, I was not made aware of their existence." Whitman's eyes narrowed. "Then I suggest you do so now." The prosecutor reviewed the documents while Jacqueline stood silently. Minutes later, he turned to the judge with a begrudging nod. "Your Honor, it appears that the defendant's records align with her claims. I will need more time to investigate further discrepancies." No. Whitman sighed, rubbing his temples. The case was supposed to be straightforward, a simple fine. Yet Jacqueline Turner had turned it into a puzzle. "Miss Turner," he said, fixing her with a sharp look, "your ability to present your case is impressive, but I find it odd that someone in your position would have such extensive legal knowledge. Are you certain there isn't more to your background than you've disclosed?" Jacqueline smiled faintly, her first real expression of emotion that day. "With all due respect, Your Honor, isn't the purpose of this hearing to address the charges? Not to discuss my background." Her words were careful, almost too careful. Whitman leaned forward, studying her intently. Something didn't add up. As the hearing concluded for the day, Judge Whitman remained unsettled. Jacqueline Turner wasn't just another defendant. Her confidence, her knowledge of legal procedures, and her precise documentation were all too polished. He decided to dig deeper. Later that evening, he made a call to an old friend in the state's legal network. "I need a favor," Whitman said. "I've got a case that doesn't sit right with me. The defendant's name is Jacqueline Turner. Can you run a background check?" There was a pause on the other end. "Did you say Jacqueline Turner?" the voice replied, suddenly tense. "Yes. Why? Do you know her?" The voice on the line hesitated before answering. "She's not who you think she is, Henry. Jacqueline Turner isn't just some defendant. She's—" The call abruptly cut off. Whitman stared at the phone, a chill running down his spine. Who was Jacqueline Turner, and what secrets was she hiding? Judge Whitman couldn't shake the cryptic warning from the call. He replayed it in his mind repeatedly that night, the words echoing in a loop. "She's not who you think she is." The following morning, Whitman arrived at the courthouse early. His curiosity had transformed into an obsession. Before proceedings began, he called his clerk, Deborah, into his chambers. "Deborah, I need you to look into yesterday's defendant, Jacqueline Turner. Quietly, search for anything unusual, past cases, employment history, even social media. And don't let this leave this room," he said firmly. Deborah nodded, though her eyes betrayed her curiosity. "Yes, Your Honor." As the day's hearings progressed, Whitman's mind wandered. He barely heard the arguments and counter-arguments presented in front of him. The courtroom became background noise, his focus instead on Jacqueline Turner's calm, almost unsettling demeanor. By noon, Deborah was in motion. Deborah's eyes passed back and forth, appearing lockstep with Deborah's mind. "You're going to want to see this," she said, placing the folder on Whitman's desk. He opened it to find a neatly compiled set of records: employment, educational background, and public records. On the surface, Jacqueline Turner appeared to be a law-abiding citizen. She had no criminal history and a modest career in business consulting. But one detail stood out: an abrupt gap in her timeline from 5 years ago. "There's no record of where she worked or lived during this period," Deborah explained. "It's like she vanished off the grid." Whitman frowned. "And her education?" Deborah hesitated. "That's the strange part. Her undergraduate degree is legitimate, but the law degree she claims to have..." She trailed off. "What about it?" "It doesn't exist. The institution listed has no record of her ever attending, let alone graduating." Whitman leaned back in his chair, his thoughts spinning. Jacqueline Turner had presented herself with the precision of a seasoned legal professional, yet there were glaring inconsistencies in her background. "Thank you, Deborah," he said quietly. "That will be all for now." The afternoon session resumed with Jacqueline Turner once again taking her place at the defendant's table. Today, her demeanor was slightly different. There was an edge to her calmness, as though she knew something Whitman didn't. The prosecutor, Mark Denning, stood to address the court. "Your Honor, after reviewing the defendant's documents, we have found no immediate cause to proceed with the contempt charge. However, the state maintains that her failure to pay prior fines remains in question." Jacqueline interjected smoothly. "Your Honor, if I may." Whitman gestured for her to proceed, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than usual. "I'd like to submit additional evidence regarding my compliance with those fines," she said, sliding another folder across the table. The bailiff delivered it to the judge, who thumbed through the pages. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the level of detail, a level that bordered on obsessive. She had photocopies of checks, bank statements, and email correspondences with court clerks. It was airtight. "Miss Turner," he said slowly, "you seem remarkably well versed in legal procedures for someone with no formal training. Care to explain why?" The gallery fell silent. All eyes turned to Jacqueline, who tilted her head slightly, a faint smile on her lips. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I don't see how that's relevant to the matter at hand." "It is when your conduct in this courtroom raises more questions than it answers," he shot back. "You walk in here as a defendant, yet you present yourself with the authority of someone who stood at this bench before. Who are you really, Ms. Turner?" The room tensed. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Jacqueline's face. It wasn't fear or anger, it was amusement. "You're quite perceptive, Your Honor," she said, her voice low but firm. "But some questions are better left unanswered." Whitman's patience snapped. "This is a court of law, not a game of riddles, Ms. Turner. Either you explain yourself or I'll hold you in contempt once again." Jacqueline sighed, leaning forward slightly. "Very well, if you insist." The room hung on her every word as she began to speak. 5 years ago, I worked in a capacity that required me to stay behind the scenes. Let's just say it involved legal matters of national importance. My role was to identify weaknesses in judicial systems and recommend reforms. But my work was not without enemies. A case I was involved in nearly cost me my life. She paused, scanning the room. The gallery was riveted, leaning in as though the walls themselves were listening. To protect myself and those I care about, I left that life behind. Jacqueline Turner isn't just my name, it's my shield. I use it to maintain anonymity while still navigating systems I know all too well. Whitman's chest tightened. He had heard of covert roles in the justice system, but had never encountered someone like Jacqueline. And why, Mr. Turner, have you chosen now to reveal this? Jacqueline smiled faintly. Because I'm tired of running. And because I knew you'd dig until you found the truth. You strike me as the type who values the law above all else. Am I wrong? Whitman didn't answer immediately. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her story. It explained her knowledge, her composure, her ability to outmaneuver the prosecution. But it also left a trail of questions. After a brief recess, Whitman returned to the bench. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice firm but measured, "while your background is unconventional, it does not exempt you from following the same laws as every other citizen. The court will adjourn for today while I review the evidence. We will reconvene tomorrow to determine the final ruling." Jacqueline nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Your Honor." As the courtroom emptied, Whitman lingered, staring at the empty defendant's table. He had no doubt that Jacqueline Turner was hiding even more than she'd revealed. The question was, how far did her secrets go, and what would it cost him to uncover them? The following morning, Judge Whitman arrived at the courthouse earlier than ever. His mind had been a battlefield of questions all night. Who was Jacqueline Turner really? And why did her presence in his courtroom feel like the opening move of a game he didn't yet understand? Before proceedings began, he received an unexpected visitor, 3/4 of his size and from California, and of whom everyone got fired up to introduce. "Michael," Whitman greeted, gesturing to a chair, "you owe me an explanation." Michael sat but didn't relax. His eyes darted around the room, as if ensuring they were truly alone. "Henry, you need to tread carefully with this case," he began. "Jacqueline Turner isn't just some former legal officer or consultant. She was part of something far deeper, an agency working on classified judicial reforms. Think of it as a shadow arm of the Department of Justice." Whitman's jaw tightened. "And you're telling me this? Why?" "Because I've seen what happens to people who dig too deep. Turner's work involved exposing corruption, Henry. Judges, lawyers, politicians, people who thought they were untouchable. She made enemies, and those enemies don't play fair. Her disappearance 5 years ago? That wasn't voluntary. Someone tried to eliminate her." Whitman leaned back, his pulse quickening. "Why would someone like her end up in my courtroom over something as trivial as parking fines?" Michael hesitated, then leaned forward. "Maybe it's not about the fines. Maybe it's about you." The words hung heavy in the air. Whitman felt a chill creep up his spine. Could this be some kind of test? Was he being targeted for reasons beyond his understanding? By the time the courtroom was in session, the atmosphere was charged. Jacqueline Turner entered with the same measured calm, but Whitman noticed the subtle shifts in her demeanor. She was alert, as though she were scanning the room for hidden threats. "Miss Turner?" Whitman began. "Before we proceed, I must ask if you're prepared to fully disclose any additional information that may affect this case." Jacqueline's gaze locked onto his. For a moment, it felt as though they were the only two people in the room. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "I've disclosed what is relevant. Anything beyond that would compromise more than just myself." Whitman frowned but nodded. "Very well. Let's proceed." The prosecutor, Mark Denning, had prepared a more aggressive approach for the day's hearing. "Your Honor, while Miss Turner has presented compelling documentation, the state believes her story is designed to obscure her true intentions. We request a formal investigation into her background and associations." Jacqueline said immediately, "Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt to deflect from the fact that the state has no case. I've provided every document requested and complied with every order. The only thing left to determine is why this court continues to entertain baseless accusations." The gallery murmured. "Oh." Denning, flustered, tried to regain control. "Your Honor, the state simply seeks to ensure the integrity of this court." Whitman held up a hand to silence the room. "Mr. Denning, while the court appreciates your zeal, I caution you against making insinuations without evidence. Ms. Turner has fulfilled her obligations thus far. If you have a legitimate reason to question her integrity, present it now." Denning opened his mouth, then closed it. Jacqueline's sharp gaze bore into him, and for the first time, Whitman thought he saw fear in the prosecutor's eyes. As the hearing paused for a recess, Whitman retreated to his chambers, but not before instructing the bailiff to ensure Jacqueline remained in the courthouse. He needed answers, and he intended to get them today. However, as he sat at his desk, his phone buzzed with an anonymous message. The screen displayed a single line of text. "Stop asking questions you're not ready to answer." His blood ran cold. He glanced at the door, then back at the phone. Who was watching him, and how had they known about his growing curiosity? The recess ended, and Whitman returned to the bench. Jacqueline Turner stood again, this time with a new air of determination. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to address the court directly." Whitman hesitated but nodded. "You may." Jacqueline turned to face the gallery. "For the past 5 years, I've lived in the shadows, avoiding the systems I once sought to protect. Today, I stand here not as a defendant, but as someone who believes in the rule of law. The accusations against me are baseless, and the prosecution knows it. But this isn't about a parking ticket or a contempt charge. This is about control, about silencing those who dared to question a broken system." Her words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Even Whitman couldn't suppress his intrigue. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice measured, "what exactly are you implying?" She turned to him, her eyes piercing. "I'm implying, Your Honor, that this case isn't an accident. It's a warning. To me, to you, to anyone who dares to seek the truth." It really is better than what could probably have been conveyed by anyone taking a look at the caseload. Well, the first thing that came to my mind was Jacqueline speaking metaphorically, or was there a real threat lurking beneath the surface? The hearing ended with no resolution, and Jacqueline was allowed to leave on her own recognizance. But as she exited the courthouse, Whitman noticed a black car idling at the curb. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his expression unreadable. Jacqueline paused, her body tensing briefly before she climbed into the car without a word. Whitman watched from the window, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. That evening, Whitman received another message, this time delivered directly to his chambers. It was a single sheet of paper with the words, "Dig deeper and you'll regret it." Judge Whitman sat alone in his chambers, the cryptic note still in his hands. The silence of the courthouse felt oppressive, almost suffocating. Outside, the sun had set, and the muted hum of traffic was the only sign of life. For the first time in years, Whitman felt the chill of uncertainty. He had spent decades navigating the labyrinth of the legal system, but Jacqueline Turner's case had turned his world upside down. He reached for his phone, hesitating briefly before dialing Michael Ellis. "Michael, he said when his friend picked up. "I've received another warning." Ellis groaned. "Henry, I told you to leave this alone. Whoever's behind this doesn't mess around." "I can't ignore it, Michael. If I back down now, I'll never forgive myself. There's more at stake here than a parking ticket or even Jacqueline Turner." There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, Ellis spoke, his voice resigned. "Fine, I'll make a few more calls, but you need to promise me something. If this gets any deeper, you walk away." Whitman didn't answer. They both knew he wouldn't. The next morning, Whitman arrived at the courthouse, determined to press forward. But as he entered the building, a young woman intercepted him. She was petite, with sharp eyes and a brisk demeanor. "Judge Whitman, my name is Agent Amanda Clark," she said, flashing a badge. "I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to talk." Whitman froze. "FBI? What's this about?" "It's about Jacqueline Turner," Clark said, her tone low, "and about your safety." She led him to a private conference room where another agent was waiting. The man, older and more weathered, introduced himself as Agent Harris. "We understand you've been presiding over Jacqueline Turner's case," Harris began. "What you need to know is that Turner isn't just a former operative. She's the key witness in an ongoing investigation into one of the largest corruption networks in the country." Whitman's breath caught. "Corruption network?" Clark nodded. "Judges, prosecutors, law enforcement officials, all of them tied to a criminal syndicate that's been siphoning money and influencing legal outcomes for over a decade. Turner's work exposed the network, but it also put a target on her back. The people you're dealing with aren't afraid to destroy anyone who gets in their way." "Wasn't I informed earlier?" "You weren't supposed to be," Harris admitted. "Turner's presence in your courtroom was an unplanned complication. We've been trying to keep her location a secret, but it seems someone found her, and now they're watching you too." Whitman felt a mix of anger and frustration. "So, what am I supposed to do? Ignore the threats? Pretend this case doesn't exist?" Clark leaned forward. "We're not asking you to ignore anything, Judge. We're asking you to let us handle it. Turner's safety is our priority, and your involvement puts both of you at greater risk." Whitman shook his head. "I can't just abandon this. If what you're saying is true, then the entire system is at risk. How can I stand by and do nothing?" The agents exchanged a look. Harris sighed. "If you want to help, we need you to proceed with the case as normal. But be careful. These people are watching your every move." That afternoon, Jacqueline Turner returned to the courtroom. She looked as composed as ever, but Whitman noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flickered to the exits. The prosecutor, Mark Denning, seemed unusually subdued. His opening arguments were lackluster, almost hesitant. It was as if he, too, had realized he was caught in something far bigger than himself. As the hearing progressed, Jacqueline stood to address the court. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of defiance. "Your Honor, I understand the gravity of the situation, but I refuse to be intimidated. The charges against me are baseless, and the continued pursuit of this case serves only to distract from the real issues at hand." Whitman nodded. "Mr. Turner, you've made your point, but I need to ask, are you willing to cooperate fully with federal authorities to resolve this matter?" Jacqueline's gaze softened slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. I've already been in contact with them, but I need your assurance that this court will uphold the principles of justice, no matter the pressure." Whitman met her eyes. "You have my word." As the day's session ended, Whitman returned to his chambers, exhausted but resolute. However, his determination was tested when he found a small envelope on his desk. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of his family taken just a week ago. On the back, A message read, "Drop the case or they'll pay the price." Whitman's hands trembled as he clutched the photo. The threat was no longer abstract. The stakes were personal now. That evening, Whitman met with the FBI agents again. "They've threatened my family," he said, his voice strained. "What do I do now?" Harris placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll protect them, Judge. We've already assigned surveillance to your home, but this only confirms what we feared. They're desperate. They know Turner's close to blowing this wide open." Whitman nodded, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. "And what about Jacqueline? If they're watching me, they're watching her too." Clark's expression hardened. "We have a plan in place, but it requires your cooperation and hers." The next morning, the courtroom was unusually quiet. Jacqueline Turner sat at the defendant's table, her expression unreadable. Whitman entered, his face set with determination. "Ms. Turner," he began, "the court has reviewed all evidence presented and finds no grounds to proceed with the charges against you. This case is hereby dismissed." The gallery erupted in murmurs, but Whitman silenced them with a sharp rap of his gavel. "However," he continued, "this court also recognizes the broader implications of Ms. Turner's situation. Federal authorities will take over from here, and this court will cooperate fully in their investigation." Jacqueline's eyes met his, a flicker of gratitude passing between them. As the courtroom emptied, Whitman watched as Jacqueline was escorted by FBI agents to a waiting car. She paused briefly, turning to meet his gaze one last time. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said softly. Whitman nodded. "Stay safe, Miss Turner." Later that evening, Whitman received a final message. It was a simple text, unsigned. "You've made the right choice, for now." The judge sat in silence, the weight of the case still heavy on his shoulders. He knew the fight wasn't over, not for him, not for Jacqueline, and not for the system they both sought to protect. But for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small measure of hope.